We're just a couple minutes after 8 o'clock. I want to thank you on behalf of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum for joining us for this program, and this program which is available thanks in part to our foundation, the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation, and it is provided in memory of Pat Finley, thanks to the wonderful donations in the memory of Pat Finley. So I am happy to be here with a few familiar faces today. And I just saw a bunch of more folks are joining. So give me 1 second here. Let their audio join. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Drink and Draw. One more second. All right, like I said, welcome to Drink and Draw. I want to share a special announcement today. We finally got the program streamlined, so I'm here providing hosting duties and tutorial duties. So again, if you joined us last month, hi Teresa, we actually have no videos on for the program. Thank you. For those of you who have joined me before, my name is Yvette, Y-V-E-T-T-E, and I am a resident artist at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, and I love bringing this program every other month to all of you, where we look at objects and stories from military history, and we envision them through the creative lens. So I want to welcome all of you here. Tonight, we are going to be doing an image from the Harry Maziak collection, and I'll explain more in the video. So a little housekeeping. As you can see, you all are muted and no videos on. That's for all of your security as well as my security, and soon I'll be sharing the screen. Occasionally, we do allow folks to share the images that they've worked on. And then we also have you email our visitor curator email. Tonight, like I said, is my first night where I'm doing double duty, hosting and giving the tutorial, but we have got the program in order so that I've pre-recorded a video, and then I will be able to follow up in the chat box. And so if you have any questions throughout any time, any part of the video, I want you to shout out to me in chat, and I will be here monitoring the chat, and I'll be able to answer all the questions you have. And if at any point during the video things get a little too fast paced, I'll judge it and assess the situation. And I just want to make sure that my captions are showing. They should be showing the closed captioning. If you would like to see your closed captioning, you should be able to see it. I have it turned on and I see it down below. So my captions should be down below. I think that's all the housekeeping. I'm going to share the video. When I share the video, give me a thumbs up in chat to make sure that you guys can see the video and hear the video. Full disclosure, I created this video. I was in town at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum this week for our 30th anniversary at our address at 30 West Mifflin Street in Madison, Wisconsin. And so I was getting all the video edited. At some point in the video, my microphone got a little crazy. So there's a couple of parts where there's a little bit of an echoey in the microphone. Don't worry, that's not your system, it's mine. I hope it's not too much of a distraction for you. I'm going to be adjusting that audio for the recording. So if you want to, some of you guys like to visit, some of you all like to visit the video on our YouTube channel from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum after. I will make sure that the updated video has the audio a little bit better fine-tuned. But before that, I think we should, other than that, I think we should be good to go. Again, welcome to Drink and Draw. We're going to have some fun tonight learning about the Esmark bandage. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, get this video started. And like I said, at any point, please use the chat function. For those of you that just joined us, please keep in mind, we don't have videos or microphones turned on for your safety and my safety. And then if there is a share portion, I will definitely let you all know. Here we go. Let Chat that you guys, once it starts playing, that you guys can hear. Today, we are going to talk about the applied arts and the many ways they're found in military service. And we will identify the MOS categories or military jobs that use the applied arts as their primary or secondary function. The object we will be examining and drawing is from the Harry T. Masiak collection at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Pictured here is what is known as an Esmark bandage, or a triangular first aid bandage with instructional illustrations printed directly on the cloth. Although the images are printed, for the sake of today's tutorial, I will be drawing with ink on an unbleached muslin fabric. As a reminder, this image will remain on screen the entire time, so you may continue to draw while I share the history of the object and the story of the veteran. Also, it will remain on screen while I teach the drawing tutorial. If you need additional reference to this image, please visit the link here and visit the Wisconsin Veterans Museum website to view the object. The supplies you will need for today's tutorial are this source image, a basic pencil, HB lead will work just fine, an artist eraser, white plastic or kneaded, whatever you have around the house, the paper of your choice, a ruler, a drafting stencil for circles if you have it, it'll come in handy, but no worries if you don't have it, a compass, and a fine tip black ink pen. As mentioned, I will be drawing on muslin fabric with ink. If you'd like to try this method, you'll need 1 square yard of bleached or unbleached muslin. It looks like this. This is a sample of the muslin. You'll also need black India ink or Sumi ink, an ink pen with a nib and a nib that won't puncture the fabric. I'll explain more about that shortly. Some tracing paper, a small jar, water, an embroidery ring. This is an embroidery ring if you're not familiar with that. I'll explain in the tutorial. Some masking tape and a small ray. So now when you're gathering your supplies, I'm going to tell you briefly about Harry Masiak. And then midway through the tutorial, the drawing tutorial, I'll pause and I'll share more about the applied arts and the very interesting history of the Esmark bandage. Now, the following language is directly from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum object record. Harry T. Masiak of Newton, Wisconsin, enlisted in the United States Army on March 9, 1942, and he went on to serve in the European theater during World War II. He brought this German Esmark bandage home as a souvenir. After training stateside, Masiak deployed in May of 1944 and served as a surgical technician with the medical detachment of the 137th Infantry Regiment, 35th Infantry Division in France. He took part in the Normandy, Northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes, and Central Europe campaigns, and he was awarded a Bronze Star and a French Croix de Guerre. He returned to the States in August of 1945, and he was discharged 2 months later. He married fellow veteran Marie R. Kutz in 1948. And if you visit us in the past, Marie's name might sound familiar because we have featured her in previous programs. She also served in Europe in World War II and received the Purple Heart because her Jeep was hit by a buzz bomb in London. So a very highly decorated military family here in Wisconsin. Before I get into the detailed penwork of the drawing, and since you are starting to draw this figure from scratch, I wanted to begin with a basic primer on the figure, on the human figure, and draft some proportions to help get you started. Often when I draw with loose expressive lines when I create figure drawings. And I usually have some exaggerated body part, like a hand or a foot, and not in a caricature sort of way, but in an expressionist sort of way that adds emphasis to a dramatic focal point. And while I like the way my drawings turn out, I always struggle with proportions and staying within the parameters of my composition plane. In other words, I draw off of the page. To help me improve with that, I've started restricting myself a little bit by creating a pre-measured area that the composition has to be created within. This is something that's especially important for me as an instructor, for me to guide you to know these basics before I then go in and encourage you to break all the rules like I do. But this process has also helped me return to the fundamentals of figure drawing that I now take for granted as second nature skills. The average human figure can be broken down into very simple and easy to remember proportions based off of the size of the human head. Now, keep in mind, I said average, and remember, there will always be variations, and every human, of course, is unique, but these rules can offer you a helpful starting point. I imagine each of you has a piece of paper in front of you. So to begin, I want to create a rectangular bounding box that will function as your bounding box or guide where the drawing should be confined. Now remember, this is a guide, so don't overthink it too much. And unless you want a permanent border, draw lightly. And one thing to note, as you look at our source image, at first glance, it feels like a simple vertical rectangle will suffice. However, keep in mind, this left arm is partially outstretched. So when you draft your bounding box, you may need a wider rectangle or maybe even a square, depending on how big of a piece of paper you're working on. The average human figure measures in a range between 6.5 to 8.5 heads high, and that many heads wide when the arms are completely outstretched, depending on the bone structure of the figure. After I examined the source image, I noticed that this figure is roughly 8 heads high and about 2 heads wide, but that doesn't include that outstretched arm. Knowing this is going to help me establish the basic framework for this composition. If I want to keep the figure within the confines of a bounding box, then I will need to make sure that I have 8 equal segments gridded out from top to bottom. My bounding box is this box right here. So I've created that bounding box. If I find the center of that bounding box, then I'm going to draw a line straight down the center. You can use your ruler to find your center, or you can eyeball it if you want. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Now, down the road, I'm actually going to be making a linoleum block. I'm actually going to be carving this linoleum block so that I can print the image on fabric. And that is why I chose the size of my drawing, because I had to base it off of the size of my linoleum, which is 12 inches. So in order to keep my 8 segments equal, I need to find a measurement that is divisible, is 12 divided by 8. To keep it simple for you today, you can either use a ruler and make your bounding box a size that's easily dividable by 8 without fractions, or you can just eyeball it. But remember, there can be a lot of math in drawing if you're striving for realistic representation. And sometimes I think it's really worth taking the extra time to strive for precision. When it comes to medical illustration, which essentially this is, precision is key. After my center line is drawn, I'm going to lightly sketch out my grid, which can all be erased when we're finished with this drawing. Now, this is for demo purposes, so I wouldn't normally be drawing this dark on the piece of paper. Since my bounding box was 12 inches high, I divided it into 1.5-inch segments. Now I'm going to use my drafting stencil here, and this is a 1.5-inch circle, and I'm going to draw a circle centered on that center line. So we drew that center line down. Now I'm going to center this with a drafting circle. It has nice little center marks for me to follow. And I'm going to go ahead and draw that circle. Now I'm using a true circle for demo purposes, but you should keep in mind that the human head is more oval or egg shape, not really a true circle. Now, I want you to sketch 8 heads down the center line. So following that same center line with your stencil, or however you decide to draw your circle, we're going to do 8 heads down the center line. The stencil is helpful because I know I'm keeping within my 1.5-inch scale. When you're finished with that, I want you to draw circles to the left and right of your head on the top. Spread them out equally until you reach your bounding box. So completely to the left side of the circle, I'm going to draw circles to my left and my right. There's a small note. If you decide, if you're not using a full 8x8 square grid, so you see here, this, let's say this is my bounding box and I did 8 heads down and then 8 heads across following that rule where your arms outstretched. If you did a square like that, no need to worry about this note. But if you did narrower than that square, you need to make sure that on your left-hand side where the arm is outstretched, that you have at least 2 heads wide on your bounding box. To keep it simple for me, I just made my bounding box at least 5 heads wide. If I wanted to, I could even align my figure all the way to the right, only using 1 to the right with 3 bounding to the left. Really, it's just this is just a guide to help you get your proportions measured out correctly. We will now use this head size as our reference measurement to build the entire body out. I cut a small 1.5 inch circle just so I could use it as a reference for this demo. So you'd see here, if I had 1.5 inch head high, I can say, okay, where does the shoulder lie? If I go 1 head over and 1 head down, that's where the top of my shoulder is going to be. Now you can also use your pencil for that reference. So if you've seen me before, if you look at my visual, I can eyeball where the top of the head is and where my thumb is. So if I hold this down to the image, so the top of my lead is the top of his head, and if I hold my finger down, that where my thumb is, that's where the chin falls. So that's the size of my head, and then I can just do that same measurement. So there's 1 head length there to the shoulder. I go down, that's where the end of the bandage goes, then to his elbow, and so on and so forth. So you can use your pencil. You can also use your compass as a measuring tool. This is helpful because there's some curves in here that using circles will help you find. So this is the size of my head. I can go down another head, and that is roughly where the bandage starts. And then that's another head at that angle, and then another head size to the top angle of that shoulder. And so if you find that center point, then you can use a series of circles to find those arches where all of those lines start connecting, especially when you are doing the striations of the muscle and this line work. This drawing was created to print on cloth. So they, in order to create gradients and volume, they had to use line work because it has to be carved. So they can't use, you can't use gradients like you would in a charcoal drawing or a painting. So the lines have to function as your volume creators. So that's where the circles really come in handy. You can see where that volume starts to be made using curved lines. We're not going to get into a lot of that today, but this tool can be really helpful in developing them. After we have our 8 circles along that center line, as you move down, you'll start to see that the bottom of each head is a reference for a reference landmark for the standard parts of the human figure. Let's take a look. If we look at the bottom of the first head, we have the chin. Followed by the bottom of the second head is the nipples or the center of the chest. Then you go to the bottom of the third, you have your belly button or your elbow. Obviously this image looking at the back, but you can imagine where that belly button would fall. At the bottom of number 4 is where your crotch would be, and then your wrist, and I've got it pretty good on my image here. If you look down, I've got the fingertips and mid-thigh, so pretty still on the money. Here I notice I start crunching up my legs a little bit. If I follow the proportions, this is the bottom of the kneecaps. This is bent, so don't look at that as reference, but here we're pretty close. Number 7 is the bottom of the calves. I'm pretty close, but I think I shortened my leg a little because you can see the bottom of the soles of my feet don't hit all the way. But again, this is averages, but if I still had this pencil, I could correct that and elongate this simply by having this grid to keep me on track. Now I've created a grid on tracing paper, you can see here, so that I can overlay it on my drawings just to use as a reference. So this might be something you want to make at home for whatever drawing you're doing. So you could just overlay it and say, yep, I'm right on track. And look, the top of those shoulders fall right on either side of the shoulders. Remember I said that this figure is about 2 heads wide. If we follow our center line down to the end of the second gridded circle, so here, we'll want to put a circle on either side of the center line. So not to the outside of the circle, but go to the center line and place your circle stencil and draw a circle there. And then to the left of the center line, we're going to do the same thing. You're going to want to move down to the 4th and do the same thing to the left and right of the center line. And these are going to help you build out where your shoulders are going to hit and where your hip bones are going to hit. And there's other angular measurements that you can get more advanced into. I would recommend looking up body proportions online, or look up Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. He talks a lot about using angles and circles and figuring out these proportions and how it all comes together mathematically. And it's really quite incredible and fun to play with and experiment with. And the more you experiment with circles and angles, the better you're going to get at creating a good composition of the human figure. And it becomes very fun too. Once you have these basic proportions started, you should be in good shape to start drawing your figure. The more you practice with proportions, the better you will be at measuring as you go, using the size of the head as reference. And you won't have to draft this grid every time. You continue to draw, and I'm going to share a little bit more about history and the applied arts. If you've never heard the term applied arts before, you might be surprised at the categories that encompass this genre. Think of things like industrial design, architecture, photogrammetry, map making, automotive design, mechanical design, ceramics, glasswork, sculptural items, woodworking, religious iconography, and fashion design. And under fashion design, think of intricate uses of knits, weaves, and even camouflage. I want to just stop the video here and let you guys know, I apologize. I actually had images that were scrolling over the screen so you could get a little bit more visual during this part of the tutorial. And for some reason they didn't translate, but just keep in mind your source image is still there on the left as we go into the history. And I'll keep the tutorial going, and I'll share some of those images with you. If we have time at the end, I can try to pull them up on my screen and share them with you. But just wanted to let you know, I didn't intend for this to just be a long-winded sermon without imagery for you. But your source image is still there on the left. And just a reminder, I'm looking over chat. So if you have any questions of what we've went over so far, chime in and I'll respond promptly. Many of the things I listed fall under military jobs categories. They also fall under the categories of engineering. So what's the difference between engineering and the applied arts? Simply put, engineering focuses on applied science, and applied arts design what the science is applied to. For example, camouflage is derived from scientific application of repeated patterns or optical illusions, and some camouflage is even perceived as quite beautiful. If we look at camouflage in the natural world, color theory is used to protect or deflect. In military applications, it's also used to protect by concealment, or in the case of dazzle camouflage, to create an optical illusion, to hide in plain sight, to not conceal at all, but to deceive what the eye sees. You may have also recognized that many on this list have the word design or craft associated with them. The formal definition of applied art is any form of art created with a practical purpose in mind. Because of the utilitarian nature of applied arts, they are often associated with the term craft, but that term has its own long and complicated history, which again, we don't really have time to get into here. For me, I believe that although this art is created with a practical purpose in mind, it still reflects the touch of an artist's hand. And I would argue that even engineers and architects claim their designs to, and I completely agree. This month, we're looking at a very specific type of applied art, a visual aid for medical application. For many years, I studied illuminated manuscripts, and I really love their quality and their sense of visual storytelling. Some of the illuminated manuscripts, in fact, tell stories only through pictorial elements because they were created at a time when the majority of people could not read. So in order to educate or tell a story, they had to use pictures. And it was often pictures of the Word of God. So think of biblical narratives or faith-based narratives. It doesn't always have to be Christian-based. They're depicted visually so you could communicate with the masses. The military uses its own type of illuminated manuscript in the form of technical training manuals. When we look at an object like the S-mark bandage, it's not hard to think about the perfect relationship between the military and the applied arts. The military requires consistent, uniform standard operating procedures, and visual aids are essential to disseminate that information so it can be absorbed by large populations with varying levels of expertise and abilities to retain knowledge. So what is the military solution? In the military, they use a pejorative but very valid phrase, they dummy-proof it. And that usually translates to simplifying instruction with pictures. Today, we're looking at the S-mark bandage, which was developed in the late 1800s by Dr. Frederick von Eismark. The Eismark bandage is one of those objects that you are really familiar with and you know a lot about, or you had absolutely no idea that it ever existed. Like with all things in history, the more time passes and objects become obsolete or they're no longer in the use of public domain, they're often long forgotten, with the exceptions of the stories that are passed down from those that use them. It surprises me that an updated version of this bandage is not still found in our household kits or in our military gear. At one point, Johnson & Johnson Company did update it and distribute it for their home first aid kits. And of course, we're all familiar with that American brand, but they eventually phased the S-mark bandage out. Dr. Eismark did not invent the triangular bandage. Rather, he enhanced it by incorporating the printed instructional drawings. On a personal side note, I get very excited as a curator when my research leads to obscure facts about the topic that may only have value to a select few, but the discovery still feels really monumental. Because my role here is to offer insight into the world of veteran art and artists, I was determined to identify the artist of the images printed on this bandage. Full disclosure, I was really hoping to identify Dr. Eismark as the artist, because scientists of his generation were also usually talented draftsmen, and also because he's a military veteran. I was able to find the artists because they are credited in the first aid manual written by Dr. Eismark himself. Their names are John Whitmock and H. Braun, and the woodcuts were done by brothers Simeon and Albert Proust. For all of you artists out there, I hope you enjoyed that short bit of art history info. The practical use for an S-mark bandage is clearly printed on the cloth. Instructions for its use in battlefield medicine. Medical emergencies call for level-headed and immediate responses. These visual aids provided simplistic guidance for a potentially turbulent situation. Not everybody can keep a manual on them, or would they even have time to refer to it? And this bandage would become the predecessor to many combat lifesaver didactics for future generations across the globe, myself included. The imagery needs to be graphically readable universally with visual language that can be absorbed in a short time and easily understood. I think it's really important that we acknowledge the genius of Dr. Eismark as a surgeon and as an innovator. But more importantly, for this program where we're here today, it's equally important to reflect on his military service. Many of the military's application of the applied arts derives from invention out of necessity, and the creative innovations of those that serve. This bandage is a prime example of innovation in medicine and the need to create or find tools and methodologies that will assist in battlefield readiness and care. Okay, so let's get back to the drawing tutorial. If you decide that you want to draw on cloth, there are a couple of things that you need to keep in mind. The first is drawing on cloth is different than drawing on paper because cloth is fibers woven together and paper is fibers pulped and then pressed together. And sometimes they're pressed together with a sizing, which is an additive used to promote adhesion and keep the paper, to help the paper reduce absorption of liquid when dry. So that was a very reductive explanation of the process. It's a little bit more complicated, but depending on the weave of your fabric, this we're using is unbleached muslin. A cotton weave comes in various weights, and better varieties have smoother textures. So you can actually see, since this is just a sample, some of the weave how the weave ends here. This is a really lightweight, unbleached muslin, cotton muslin. Depending on the weave of your fabric, this is an unbleached cotton muslin. Cotton weave comes in a variety of weights, and the better quality weights have smoother texture. But even fine woven material can be penetrated with a sharp object, which is why I caution about sharp pen nibs. Muslin is a very inexpensive fabric and it accepts dye really well. However, for that same reason, it has a tendency to allow ink to spread or to bleed. Like with paper, the type of fabric or the type of paper and the type of ink you use will produce varying results. So it's best to test your materials before committing to a final direction. So we're going to do exactly that. I have this small sample of muslin that I'll be using, and it's tightly stretched, as you can see in this embroidery ring. I'm doing this just to keep the fabric taut, and it keeps them from buckling or folding over back into the ink. You can stretch it like a canvas or tape it to a board, but I wouldn't recommend for what we're doing today, taping it to a board. Embroidery rings are fairly inexpensive and very user-friendly, so this is what I'd recommend. And today I'm going to sample a variety of pens with different types of ink and nib styles and sizes. And we're going to test a bleed factor, which I find completely ironic since the Esmark bandage was used to dress bleeding wounds. We won't be looking at brush work today because we're looking at a specific line quality, but you certainly could brush ink onto this fabric. We're going to be looking at a Sharpie fine tip pen. The inks are permanent, but not archival, meaning they will fade over time. This fine tip nib is about 8.8 millimeters. We're also going to be looking at the graphic micron pen with various nib sizes. They are all archival waterproof inks and have much higher quality than the Sharpie. And then we're going to look at a quill style speedball calligraphy pen with a calligraphy nib. I got these B5, B6 calligraphy nibs. We're going to use the B6 because it's a little bit more of a square nib and not as sharp, and it won't puncture the fabric. And then finally, we're going to look at this golden Rit hand-blown glass nib pen. This is my new purchase. I'm excited to use it. Oh, and we will be using the wooden stylus, bamboo stylus. It's a calligraphy stylus. So those are the types of pens we're going to be using, and then you'll need India ink or the super black ink, India ink, or Sumi ink. I don't have the bottle of Sumi ink in front of me, but any black pen ink, the calligraphy ink that comes with the stylus would work as well. So let me get my supplies ready, and then we're going to go over and test some of these pens out for their bleed factor. I have a template that we're going to draw onto for each style of pen. It's laid out in pencil, so if I hold it up a little closer, you can kind of see where I've created a template. And we're going to be looking for a couple of factors on each pen. What we're looking for is, number one, how easily does the nib travel across the surface? I'll call it the snag rating. And number two, the bleed spread factor. Does the bleed expand outward, like when ink is dropped in water? And how much does it spread? And what is the bleed through rate? Does the ink bleed through the fabric to the back side? And if so, how much? And then what are the layering capabilities? Can I apply line over line and do they stay crisp, or do all the lines bleed together? So let's go ahead and give this a try. The first line we're going to look at is the fine tip Sharpie. So I've got my fine tip Sharpie here. And like I said, it's an 8mm nib. You can see the nib here. I'll hold it up a little closer. It'll focus on that. There it goes. So you can see it's a pretty wide tip for being fine tip compared to what you'll see on the other pens. And what I've done here is I've just made a little square outline for myself. And I'm just going to draw over my template with the Sharpie, and I'll hold it up in a second. Now, as I'm drawing, I can hear a little scratching. And that scratching, as I'm drawing, it's not too bad, but I am getting caught, what we call snag. I am catching in the fabric a little bit, and that's normal. I mean, we're working on fabric. I told you we're going to be working with the weave, but you can see this nib doesn't, unless I really push, it's not puncturing through, but it is, when I hold it down, it does start to create a little bit of a bleed out by holding the nib down on there. But you can see it's a pretty good line at first. And then what I'll do is I'll do this for each one. I'm going to do a cross hatch within this square. So we can feel the snag factor, but I'm also want to see how well it holds up fine lines and as I continue to work in. So far, I'm not seeing a lot of bleed. The real factor is after it sits for a second, is it going to continue to expand out or is it going to keep that crisp line? Now you can see even when I go lightly, I still have a fairly thick line, so a variety of line widths. I don't have a lot of option, but it's holding lines pretty well, I think. I don't think they're really bleeding into one another. We're still seeing the delineation between lines. Now I'm going to flip over, see what our bleed through. Not too bad. A little bit, you can see on the line, I held the nib to it, so of course it bled through. But for the most part, not a lot of bleed through, so it held up pretty well. And it's pretty clear, right? It's trying to focus on me. Hold on. And that's pretty clear. Sorry, there we go. Okay. So now, I said we weren't going to do brushwork, which we're not, but this micron does come with a brush nib. So I am going to try the brush nib. Now, when I open it, you see it's like a little paintbrush on the end of the nib. And next to my square, I'll see it bends. And it works just like the end of a fine tip paintbrush. The difference is I don't have to dip it into any vial of ink. And that's, you know, it's still giving me a line. What's nice about the brush is I could get a variety of line widths if I wanted, which might be able to come in handy with this drawing, because then I'd want to do a variety of lines. I'm just not going to get that fine, really crisp, thin line. So this is micron brush. Now, since it's a brush and it's a softer tip, I'm not getting any snag factor. But I am not, because it's not dipped in ink, I don't get a lot of pigmentation. I don't get a lot of saturation. But for the most part, I mean, it feels just fine. For this particular drawing, this is not the option I would go for, but you can see it holds its line just fine. It's just a thicker line. Bleed through, yeah, not too bad. It's a little bit, I think it's a little bit more. It goes a little bit, and you can see where you start to see that sort of like jagged edge. That's where you start to at closer examine, if I looked at this with a microscope, it would mean that it was bleeding just a little bit. It had a little bit more of a spread. Okay, so that was the micron brush. Now we're going to do the micron 005, which is the smallest nib I can get on this. And you can barely see it in this camera. I don't even know if I hold it, if I can get it. Really teeny tiny, really tiny nib. So when I'm drawing with these on paper, I have a very heavy hand. So these, I have a tendency to mess these nibs up right away. And you can see, because it's so small, that it does have the potential to really go through my fibers. It did. I just punctured the fiber there. Let me see if I can get it in the camera here. So I'm punctured through. I'm trying to get it. There you go. You can see it there, that little pen mark. I've punctured through with the nib. So I likely wouldn't be using this one because I do have a little bit more snag, because that little teeny tiny nib is catching every weave as I go along. So it doesn't give me a lot of room to maneuver with. However, I'm getting this really thin, tiny line. So if I wanted really intense, detailed line work, this would work. However, it is a little bit lighter just because I'm not putting as much pigment. I mean, if you look at that black versus here, it's not because it's not good ink. It's because I have a tiny nib that I can't add a lot of pressure down onto this fabric. Not that even on paper, you don't want to use a lot of pressure on this. This is for nice, fine, intricate details. And I'm going to do a few lines so you can see how it actually holds up the definition of this line to build up some value. So I'll pull this up. So you can see it actually is still holding individual lines there, and they're not bleeding together, and they're really thin lines, and really no bleed at all on that one. No bleed through at all. So that was the micron 05. Now we're going to go to the micron 01, which is the next pen size up. See, it's sort of, there you go. Sorry about the focus, folks. There we go, got it. So this is micron 01, so a 0.01 millimeter. And I've already seen improvement in my scratch snag factor. Oh, this I have 0.1. And so I've already got smoother feel to this. So on fabric, I would say if you need a real fine line, I'm still in a real fine, thin line, I would go with this 0.1 and not even bother with the 0.05, because I can still get a pretty tiny line. Now, I know there's some perfectionists out there that would probably still want to go that route, and that's fine. This is your preference. So you can see that's the micron 01. Got some really great quality line work. You see where it looks dotted up at that top corner? That's the snag factor. So you can, that might be helpful in one of these engraving type style drawings where we want it to have that. But if you're looking for a nice smooth transition, then it's going to be how you're holding your pen and your pen work. Again, not really bleeding through. So difference between micron and Sharpie so far looks like we're going to have less of a bleed through rate, which is good. And remind you, these are waterproof. So if you drew on fabric, it'd be washable. Now we're going to go with the 02. Again, this is going to get redundant, but as you know, we're just going, the nibs are just getting a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. I had some fabric on. Let's do this. All right, so this is micron 02. A little bit more of a snag factor, and it's probably just because I'm at the top of this sample fabric and it is not as tightly stretched. But now I'm starting to get a little bit more pigment, so it's a little bit coming in a little bit clearer. And I'm still getting a pretty fine line. So you're not, I mean, I'm showing you this and you're not going to see a lot of variations in these, but if you are looking for the precision of your project and you want to make sure that the materials you're using are going to be the best materials you can use for the project you are making, doing little sample runs like this will really help you save time. It takes time, but in the end, it will help you save time. So already I'm seeing ways in which I build lineup and how I change styluses. So that was micron 2. Let's go to micron 3. So micron 3, I probably would say for standard projects, if I'm just trying to do some basic outline work, I go with the 3 because it gives you a little bit wider dip. I keep trying to, but it still gives you a pretty thin line without going all the way to the 8 like the Sharpie. And this was not one of my new pens, so I have a little bit less ink in this. So I'm going to vouch for the 3, but I'm going to tell you right now, my lines are a little bit more scratchy, more rough, because I don't have as much ink left in this pen. But not much, you can see there's not a lot of difference. It's when you're working with fine line work on paper that these pens and their various nibs really come to play. For what we're doing today, it's good to have the knowledge. 5 is almost an 8. That's the 5 tip right there. Little snag factor. Not bad. Goes on fairly smooth at a diagonal up and down, not too shabby. Put a little bit more weight there. Now with this one, since it's a little bit wider, I want to see if these lines hold their own or if they start bleeding into one another. So I'm going to let that one sit for a second. Let's go up. Seems like they're holding together, but it does seem like they might be. They're holding their own shape. I don't know if they're, it feels like they might be bleeding into one another just a little bit. Again, not a lot of bleed through on that one. It's 5. Yeah, and I pushed a little bit harder on this one, so you are getting a little, but still not a lot of bleed through at all. That's it. I wanted to stop the video just for a second there. I know that's a lot of technical testing of pens, so I just wanted to check in with everybody, see how their drawings come along, see if we seeing if we have any questions about the figure, which is still, the source drawing is still up on the left there. Just to check in. We've lost a couple folks from the program. That could just be because folks had other schedules, but since I know I spent a lot of time looking through these different types of pens, just wanted to check in with everybody, see how you're doing. For the most part, I think everybody on the video has visited us before. So if you wanted to, let me know in chat that you had a question, I'd be happy to unmute you and hear your question. If not, I'll just keep, we've got a few more pens to go, and then you'll see me drawing the figure on fabric. So chime in on chat, and I'd be happy to pause the video again and let you ask a question. Okay, here we go. Make me happy. So the micron 8, this nib is going to be the same size as what you saw in the Sharpie. Pretty big nib. And look at that pigment. Look at that pigment coming out. So a lot darker line, a little bit thicker, but you are getting a nice dark, almost cartoon-like line. So I'm not getting a real, I won't be able to get real tiny details like the 1. It's nice, we'll have the 8 right next to the 1, so you can really see the difference. So as I start to cross hatch in here and build this up, I just want to see how well I maintain that. For me, I think that looks pretty nice. I'm going to flip it over and do a little bit of bleed through. I actually layered a lot and there's not a lot of bleed through, so that's pretty good. That's actually, I would say, success for an 8 versus, so you've got micron 8 versus your Sharpie. Probably about the same because I added a lot more on that corner there. So you can see as they start to really settle into those fibers, they do come through just a little bit, but not too bad. All right, we're almost through this little test here. We have ink with metal nib. So I've got the speedball metal nib, and then I keep a little jar with water near me. And there are nib cleaners for these. I'm just using water today, but you also want a little rag and a sample paper next to you so that you can get that tip up. So ink nib. So I'm going very carefully with this one because it's a metal nib that could puncture the fabric fairly easily. And if you've never used this type of pen and ink nib, I would recommend practicing this on paper before you go to fabric, because there are specific ways that you have to use these pens. And I like this square nib because I can get a fine line, but I can still transfer over and get a thick line. So you have a little bit more variation with these nibs, just the more you practice and know how to use them. So I got a little snag, which will make that little jetted line a little bit more. And then I want to point something out. You see that L on the middle? That's what I'm talking about with bleed. I accidentally put pressure down a little too hard and then it bled out and just created that little like droplet puddle there. But you can see I've got a little stuttered lines, a little bit of snag factor. But all in all, it kept a pretty great variation of line. And then you can see the bleed. This one has a little bit more bleed, and that's because of the ink nibs. You have to just be a little bit careful because you have to learn pen control with these. And you'll see this as I go to the wood stylus. The wood stylus, the concept is that ink sits in here and then it goes out. This is another one you have to heed and practice with. This one is not going to get me as crisp of a line. It's meant to help you a little bit more of a brush style. So I have a much thicker line. And again, with any of these, depending on how well you are versed in using them, you can't always manipulate your tools to do whatever you want. So just because I don't have the greatest result here doesn't mean that it can't do what we need it to do. Just for the sake of what we're doing today, I don't think this would be the great tool because see how thick it is. But you could do some fun stuff with the wooden nib in other projects. I did want to point out that I did a test run of this, and when I did the wood nib, you could see it was a little bit more, it bled a little bit more, it had a tendency to really just sort of spread and had a lot more jagged lines. So again, the more you use the materials, the better you get at them, but just keep in mind, they're not always going to yield the perfect result you want. Now, this is the new Golden glass blown pen nib. You can see it's got little spirals on the end of it to help the channel the ink. And it's a dip pen. So I'm going to dip it in the ink. And I've got a pretty sharp stylus, but it's rounded, so it doesn't, it won't puncture. And this is the True Black India ink. So already I see better pigmentation. And I'm keeping a pretty fine line. I'd say it's in the round between a 3 and a 5. And by channeling the ink in this, I won't have to dip very often. And so far, I really like the feel of this. I don't have much snagging. I feel like I'm able to apply ink the way I want it to. And I didn't have to put a lot of ink on the nib to have a successful transfer. So you can see that's the India ink. This is the stylus I will be using on my main drawing. So low snag rating, pretty good line quality holding up. Let's see. A little bit of bleed through, but it's because I'm actually able to apply a good saturation of ink on there. So curve lines, trying to get variation of weight. I can get a little variation of weight. That's nice. Angles, go a little bit smaller. Can't necessarily make it go really thin, but can definitely get myself some variation. So I think I'll be pleased with this option using it on the full drawing. Could even use the side of the stylus and get you a little bit of So that wraps up. I'm testing my ink on fabric, and we will wrap up the tutorial with me showing you how I'm drawing the figure on fabric. I transferred it. I drew it on paper. Then I put that image behind my fabric, and then I traced with pencil. So I already have the drawing prepared, and I will be showing you that in just one moment. It was really great that we took the time to go over our different. Again, I apologize for the audio on this. If it bothers anybody, let me know, and we'll get through this portion fairly quickly. Pen types and ink types that we wanted to use to draw on fabric. But now it's really just time to get into the drawing. So what I have here is I mentioned that if you were going to draw on cloth and you wanted to make your own Esmark bandage, you would need at least 3 square feet of unbleached muslin fabric. I have that here, and that is 3, if you look at a yard of fabric, that is 3 feet. So it's going to be pretty wide. I'm 5 feet tall. So that's going to be almost my, the width of my wingspan here, because I'm a short person. But if we look at this, it's going to be really large. And so I'm going to have the linoleum block that I showed you that is 12 inches high. And I was fortunate, I have a larger embroidery ring that actually works really vertically. So I've got a nice rectangular, well, it's an ovular area to work with that I have really pre-stretched here on this muslin. And I'm going to pull it a little bit tighter. It's been this, I prefer the plastic rings to the wooden. Wooden are more environmentally sound, of course, but simply because the plastic have a tendency, if you're drawing or doing any sort of printing, which I've done in the past, they hold your canvas a lot tighter. This wood has a tendency to crack. Either way, the wooden one is what I have, so it works really well. The plastic just seem to hold it a little bit more firmly in place, which with the wood, that's not as big of a deal with embroidery, but for drawing on it, it can lead to some problems. For today, we're going to go with the wood, and you can see, like I mentioned, I already had the image traced on it with pencil, and what I did was I simply put the drawing on the back. You can't see it here, but I put it against the light table. You can do it against the window, and so I can see the drawing through. You could draw directly on to the fabric too, if you're brave enough. I wanted to make sure I had the drawing correctly composed before I went and started drawing on the fabric. So I'm going to be using this Winsor Newton Black India ink, but you can also use the Speedball Super Black India ink, or I mentioned Sumi ink. So I'm gonna, or whatever color ink you want, or handmade ink, iron ball inks. I'm gonna talk about those in the future tutorial. Today I'm going to use the Winsor Newton, or again you could use the Speedball calligraphy ink that came with the pen that we're going to use, and I'm going to use the Golden Red Glass Blown nib. So very excited about this new tool. As I mentioned previously, you're going to be drawing on fabric. You want to rag around something to make sure that you see there's a lot of gathering of fabric on either side of this. So I want to make sure that I keep a tidy workspace so that I'm not getting ink everywhere. In my screen printing class in college, my professor said ink is contagious. Once it's one place, it gets everywhere. So you need to be aware of your studio space and keeping your area tidy. So I'm just going to go right in. There's a lot of tutorial that I'm teaching in this. I'm using a dip pen, as I mentioned before, and I want to make sure that I start drawing on the line. The ink hasn't really caught into my nib yet. So I just tapped that on the side on a piece of paper and it moved the ink toward the tip. So it's good to do that off of your drawing surface. But we did all the tests for bleed, and I want to make sure that you take your time with this. I'm going with my little bit thicker lines first, just to give me a foundation and give this camera something to focus on. Also, I'm finding this fabric is not stretched as tightly as was in the sample image. So see, you can already see I'm going to keep my hand here just so the camera, I'm going to make some adjustments on the camera. I zoomed in on the camera because I wanted to make sure that it didn't continue to keep redoing the focus, which it seems to be doing anyway. So I want to make sure, as long as there's something in focus, the camera doesn't mess around. So I mentioned in the practice round that this dip pen is really nice, because as long as you get a fairly decent dip and you test it, you don't have to recharge it that often. It holds a lot of ink. It's a surprising amount of ink. And if you're wondering, or you didn't hear me when I was talking about drafting this image, if you joined us late, why are all these lines here? Why do we need all of these lines on this figure? Well, this image was printed on fabric with a wood engraving, which means they had a piece of wood and the image was drawn on the wood, and then it had to be carved into the wood. And unlike charcoal or painting, where you could use different type of blending methods to create gradient, or that gradient helps you develop this volume. Unlike that, on a wood engraving, you have to use line work to define volume. So that's why we have all these lines here. And the masters of this do wonderful variations of line width, line sizes, thin and curved lines, to really do the most with the least. My lines right now are appearing to be all in similar weight, so that meaning that thickness all remains the same. If we wanted to, we could look at, I'm going to set my ink nib down. Since we tested different pens, if you remember, I believe it was, your 0.1 nib has a thinner nib. So if I wanted to go in here with ink, this is still archival ink. So it's not going to be, you can't really tell in the camera, but it is just a slightly different color of black. But if I wanted to get really thin lines in there, I could use this pen and really start developing a smaller line. Or on this knot of this cloth, I could start this drawing by doing thin lines with this 0.01 micron pen. And see, you got a nice little, you're starting to get a little bit more of a variation, because if I went with a really thin line, and I think I'm being more careless because I'm going over a trace drawing. If I were drawing this from scratch, I think in my mind, I would be considering more where to put the variation. So I'm sort of thinking out loud on how I would approach this differently in the future. But now you see, if I add this pigment from the ink nib with a wider, you really start to build that variation, which makes for a much stronger composition, in my opinion. It starts to feel more realistic. And in any drawing that you're thinking about, first of all, we don't like to do straight outline and drawing. You start developing your line work to using the variation of this line, then creates your outline, so you don't have a cartoon-like black outline. Okay, folks, so I have a little bit more on that video. It's really just pretty much me filling in the drawing. Oh yeah, Sherry, no problem. I appreciate you checking in. We had some folks wondering how much longer we had. Normally we go an hour. Now that I'm doing these videotapes and I'm the host, I'm letting it go a little bit longer. But I did want to check in again, see if anybody any questions on the figure. I know this one was a little bit different. We had I was looking at drawing on fabric, but showing you some of the composition, some of how you would scale the figure. I did want, if anybody's interested, so most of you guys, I think, joined me last month when we had ballpoint pen, or a couple months ago when we did ballpoint pen drawings. And I just want to show you something. I'm going to go, hopefully my overhead camera will still show me a visual. Oh, I have to do, give me 1 second. I have to do a background change. Okay, so now you see my overhead drawing. Does everybody see what I've got on the camera? We've got the ballpoint pen drawing. I continued to work on this drawing using those really delicate lines. And this is how far I've gotten in 2 months. I worked on it probably a couple nights a week, just really still taking my time with this drawing. I see a heart up there. Thank you. Yeah, but you can see we really started, I filled in that the figure here, and it's coming together. But oh gosh, I'm getting used to this overhead camera. And then working on the stipple drawing there, it is going to become a really beautiful drawing. But this is what I tell you as we're working on these types of drawings, just keep working on things, and it might take a little bit longer, but it's just about endurance. It's a game of endurance. I would normally share with you our email to visit our curator. I apologize. I forgot to check in with Molly and confirm that email address. So You are welcome to join us next round. So we're in June now, July, August, we'll be back. I had scheduled Amber Zora, who was a visiting artist prior. I'm not sure if we're still going to have Amber in August. If not, I'll be back. I'll always be here. We're still deciding what the tutorial will be for August. Again, don't hesitate to email us and let us know if you have any suggestions, or put it in the chat of things you'd like to see on Drink and Draw. I didn't get to the part in the drawing that tells you I actually picked the Esmark bandage for today's tutorial just because I thought it was something very interesting. This year happens to be Dr. Esmark's 200th birthday. So he was born in January 200 years ago. He obviously is not still with us. And I mentioned his military record. He is not an American military veteran. He served during the Franco-Prussian Wars. He served in multiple conflicts in the late 1800s in Germany. So we owe a lot of our current medical technologies to Dr. Esmark. He actually is noted for inventing the cold pack, the ice pack. So if you've ever sprained your ankle and you need to use an ice pack, you can give a shout out to Dr. Frederick von Esmark. And I am not from Germany. I'm not German, so I may have butchered some of the German names in there. And for that, I apologize. Let me know if you have any questions. Again, I thank each and every one of you for joining us this evening. Me, Drink and Draw, our Drink and Draw family. I love to see all the familiar faces. And we will probably, I'm thinking August might be a good time, mid-year, for us to show some of our drawings. So if you come in August, you heard it here. If you're a name that I've seen before on our list, bring your drawings that you've done before, and we'll share some of those drawings. Sherry, thanks so much. Email Molly and we'll get you in contact with me and while you're still in town. We are wrapped up for tonight. I want to thank all of you and have a good evening. I'll play us out with some music. And I'll play the music. Yeah, we'll just send you out and send a picture of your drawing. Yes. Oh, wait. You sent a picture, Margaret and Joe sent a picture of the drawing to visitor curator. It hasn't been returned. So maybe it's working. Yeah, I get those images when Molly usually forwards them to me. So keep sending them to visitor curator, and I'll check in with Molly and see if we've gotten any. And then in August, I'll share drawings. Yes, Sherry, email Molly and she'll get you in contact with my personal email email the visitor curator email and she'll get us in contact with one another. I don't share that on the public Zoom. Okay. Thanks, Sherry. Be safe out there. And yes, again, I'm kind of all over the place. Forgive me. I drank Pepsi too late this evening. Send your pictures if you want. Drawings, please send your drawings from Drink and Draw to the visitor curator email, and we'll share them in August. If you don't have that email, bring them with you in August. And I've got a pretty good photographic memory, so I see all the names here. I'll let you share your screen to show us your drawings in August, because that's the one thing, since we had to go with the extra security, that I miss. We aren't able to interact as much as we did in the early days of Drink and Draw. And that's kind of what Drink and Draw is about, people gathering together to spend some time drawing. So it's about that community, in that art community. Well, y'all, it's summer. I think you should all go out and enjoy your evening. Hopefully your air quality is not too bad from the fires. If you, excuse me, if you or any of your loved ones are near the fires, please be safe. And let's keep all of the firefighters in our thoughts. Have a good evening. Good night.